All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're embarking on what is essentially a multi-generational detective hunt. For centuries, human beings have looked up and mapped the stars, we've explored the deepest oceans, and we've charted out the continents. But despite having mapped the actual cosmos, the absolute most profound mystery remains those 3 pounds of fat and water locked right inside our own skulls. Seriously, what exactly is the human mind? How does it actually work? And why in the world do we behave the way we do? Well, throughout this explainer, we're going to trace the fascinating history of how the greatest thinkers in modern history have tried to crack this ultimate enigma.
And that brings us right to the core mystery of our investigation. Early psychologists were up against a pretty monumental problem. Think about it. Unlike biology or chemistry, how do you study something you literally can't touch, weigh, or stick under a microscope? You obviously can't hold a thought in your hands, right? You can't measure a feeling with a ruler. So, our understanding of human behavior actually comes from this chronological chain of intellectual rebellions. As we go through this, you'll see that every generation of psychologists proposed a radically different lens to investigate with, often completely tearing down the ideas of the folks who came right before them.
So here's our map for today. We're going to hit 5 major sections: decoding the human mind, the mind as a survival tool, only what we can see, diving into the unconscious, and finally, seeing the whole picture. Let's get right into it. Now you'll see that this is a continuous, evolving story. We kick things off in 1879 with structuralism, which kind of triggers the evolutionary era of functionalism. From there, the pendulum swings wildly toward the observable era with behaviorism, and then we take a deep dive into the modern era of psychoanalysis, before finally landing in the Gestalt era of perception. The key takeaway here is that these aren't just isolated historical events. Each school of thought evolved chronologically, acting as a direct and sometimes pretty aggressive reaction to the framework that was established right before it.
Section 1. Decoding the Human Mind. Structuralism.
We start our official investigation with the very foundation of the field, laid down by a German psychologist named Wilhelm Wundt. The year is 1879, and Wundt does something completely unprecedented. He opens the world's first psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. With that one single act, psychology officially transitioned from purely philosophical musings into a real experimental science. Wundt, who's often called the father of psychology, wanted to take the mind apart into its basic elements, which sounds a bit wild when you think about it. He was basically trying to disassemble a fleeting thought the exact same way a mechanic disassembles a car engine to see all the individual gears and bolts. He and his followers used this method called introspection, where they trained people to look inward and carefully report back on their exact sensations, feelings, and thoughts in response to specific stimuli.
So these structuralists operated on a few core principles. First, they viewed the mind as the total sum of your experiences, your thoughts, your feelings, your imagination. And your consciousness, well, that's simply the sum of all those mental experiences happening at this exact given moment. But here is the real kicker. They believed in something called mind-body parallelism. Imagine your mind and your body are 2 trains running on parallel tracks. They are traveling at the exact same speed, going on the exact same journey, but they never ever touch, and they don't cause each other to move. For every single event in the mind, there's a corresponding physical event, but they just run completely side by side.
Section 2. Mind as a survival tool. Functionalism.
Now, as groundbreaking as structuralism was, its rigid, laboratory-based approach really frustrated thinkers like William James. He's famously known as the father of American psychology. He basically looked at this and completely stopped asking, what is the mind made of, and started asking the much more practical question, what is it doing? William James and his followers just weren't interested in a static inventory of thoughts. They wanted to know the function of our mental processes and, more importantly, how those processes actually help us operate out in the real world.
And this is where functionalism brought evolution into the conversation. They considered the human mind to be a relatively recent development, something still in an evolutionary phase. Why do we even have higher mental processes in the first place? Simply because we needed them to survive. For example, your ability to feel fear or analyze a tricky situation isn't just some random static element floating around in your head. It's a highly tuned evolutionary tool that literally kept your ancestors from getting eaten. So unlike the structuralists, functionalists believe the mind and body are intrinsically one unit, working seamlessly together to help us adjust to our constantly changing environment.
Section 3. Only what we can see. Behaviourism.
All right, moving forward, a psychologist named J.B. Watson looked at all that inward-looking introspection and basically threw his hands up. He argued that if psychology was going to be taken seriously as a true science, it had to completely ditch the invisible, subjective mind altogether. I mean, you can't measure a thought, so why even try to study it?
This led to a highly mechanical, almost robotic view of human beings. Behaviorism strictly reduced psychology to this purely physical, observable loop. It goes like this. Step 1, you have an environmental stimulus. Step 2, your receptors, your sense organs, detect that stimulus. Step 3, your effectors, meaning your muscles and nerves, are triggered. And finally, step 4, you get an observable response. That's it. No invisible thoughts, no introspection, just a purely measurable physical reaction. Watson, along with other heavy hitters like Skinner and Pavlov, fiercely argued that our chief task is exclusively studying overt observable behavior. To a strict behaviorist, you are 100% the product of your surroundings. In fact, Watson famously boasted that if you gave him a dozen healthy infants, he could train any single one of them to become any type of specialist, a doctor, a lawyer, even a thief, purely by controlling their environment. They believed absolutely all behaviors learned through your interaction with the world, and those environmental forces are what entirely build your personality.
Section 4. Diving into the unconscious. Psychoanalysis.
So right when the world was convinced that only the physical surface mattered, along comes Sigmund Freud, and he plunges us deep into a hidden, incredibly mysterious world. He completely upends this idea that we're rational creatures fully aware of everything we do. According to psychoanalysis, the conscious part of your mind, the part you are aware of right now listening to this, is actually the smallest slice of the pie. The subconscious is a bit larger. That holds things you aren't currently thinking about, but you could remember them if you tried. But the unconscious? That is by far the massive, dominant layer. This huge, inaccessible space hides our repressed wishes, our dark desires, and those primal drives that secretly and heavily influence our everyday behavior.
Freud believed that human behavior is actually the result of a relentless, hidden battle happening right down there in the unconscious. He split our personality into 3 distinct aspects. Think of the id as a feral toddler demanding exactly what it wants right this second, driven entirely by raw, instinctive desires. On the totally opposite end, you have the superego. That is basically an incredibly strict, rule-following parent representing your moral compass and your inhibitions. Naturally, these two are in continual, exhausting conflict. And stuck right in the middle is the ego, basically the exhausted babysitter, frantically trying to use reason and real-world experience to resolve this war between your wild instincts and your strict morals. Freud argued that when we fail to resolve this ongoing battle, it leads to abnormal behavior.
Section 5. Seeing the whole picture. Gestalt Psychology.
Finally, Max Wertheimer and the Gestalt psychologists looked at all this. The structuralists breaking the mind into tiny elements, the behaviorists breaking actions into tiny stimulus-response steps, and they decided everyone was missing the forest for the trees. They stepped back from all those tiny pieces to look at the big picture. Their entire philosophy can be summed up in one incredibly famous maxim: the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Think about it. When you listen to your favorite song, you don't just hear a series of individual, isolated acoustic frequencies, right? You hear a melody, a rhythm, a complete emotional organization. Gestalt psychology argues that humans naturally perceive things as complete organizations, not just as random collections of disjointed pieces.
They believe that it's the whole context that actually determines the behavior of the individual parts. In this view, human perception is ultimately a problem of organization. Learning doesn't just happen through blind repetition or mechanical stimulus-response loops. No, meaningful learning takes place when you actively organize your perceptual field in an intelligent way. You are constantly connecting the dots, uniting all these fractured clues about your environment to make sense of the world around you.
So, from taking the mind apart like a car engine, to viewing it as an evolutionary survival tool, to mapping observable physical responses, diving deep into the hidden unconscious, and finally, organizing the whole picture. To wrap up this explainer, I just want you to remember that these aren't just dry chapters in some dusty history textbook. They are vital, distinct lenses that we absolutely need to truly understand the sheer complexity of human nature. We kind of need all of them to grasp the full spectrum of why we do what we do. And it leaves us with a really fascinating question to ponder as we go about our day. When you look at your own life, your own choices, and your own mind, which of these 5 historical lenses do you think truly drives you the most?